continent, every state has critical infrastructure demands. Bridges that need repair, railways that need maintenance, sewer systems that desperately need expansion and renovation. Over a month ago now, a bipartisan group of senators announced a deal with the White House on a framework for a bipartisan infrastructure bill, a breakthrough moment. Ever since, I have committed both publicly and privately to put that bill on the Senate floor. Unfortunately, last week our Republican colleagues prevented the Senate from taking a procedural step to begin the debate. But I want to be very clear. I am fully committed to passing a bipartisan infrastructure bill. As a majority leader, I have the ability to move to reconsider the vote to begin debate on that bill this week. Since senators are still finalizing the text of the agreement, senators should be on notice that the Senate may stay in session through the weekend in order to finish the bill. Let me say that again. Senators should be on notice that the Senate may stay in session through the weekend in order to finish the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And, as I've said before, further delays may mean that the Senate will remain in session into the previously scheduled August recess. We have reached a critical moment. The bipartisan group of senators has had nearly 5 weeks of negotiations since they first announced an agreement with President Biden. It's time for everyone to get to yes and produce an outcome for the American people. I understand that bipartisan achievements are difficult in our polarized times. Extreme partisans are always rooting for failure. Look no further than the former president. Just this morning, former President Trump released a statement urging Republicans to retreat from all bipartisan negotiations on infrastructure until after the midterm elections in 2022, maybe longer. Again, the former president said this morning that Republicans are weak fools and losers, his words, for even talking to Democrats, and suggested that the Republicans should not negotiate at all unless they're in the majority. Fox News personalities, following his lead, are now encouraging primaries for Republican senators who support a bipartisan infrastructure deal. Look, there are always going to be radical voices on the far right who brook no compromise. But that's only a recipe for obstruction and gridlock. We have the opportunity right now to actually accomplish something good for the American people. Will our Republican colleagues follow the absurd demands of a disgraced former president and his media allies? Or will they get a good bipartisan deal over the finish line? Republican senators must ignore former President Trump if we're ever going to make progress for the American people. He's rooting for our entire political system to fail. I and the rest of my Democratic colleagues are rooting for a deal. Now, on nominations. The Senate will not remain idle in the meantime. This week we'll consider several highly qualified nominees to the Biden administration. Tonight, the Senate will invoke cloture on Todd Kim, someone the senator from Illinois has just spoken about, to serve as the Assistant Attorney General and the head of the Environmental and Natural Resources Division of the Justice Department, where he worked as a lawyer for nearly 8 years. The son of Korean immigrants, Mr. Kim fell in love with America's natural treasures at a young age when his parents took him on an RV trip across the American West. After tonight, he'll be in a position to defend those very treasures by making sure our environmental laws are enforced, our federal lands are maintained, and our relationship with Native tribes is respected. I look forward to confirming his nomination. Senators should also be aware that there may be additional votes on nominations this week, including members of the National Labor Relations Board and potentially votes to advance nominees from our Senate committees. The Senate has a constitutional duty to advise and consent on presidential appointments. We'll continue that important work this week. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Whip.
I ask consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to just back up what the Majority Leader said. The day was May 22nd, 2019. I remember it well. Two things happened that morning. First was the birth of my granddaughter, which was an exciting and happy event. The second was just the opposite. It was a meeting in the White House with President Donald Trump. And the purpose of the meeting was to discuss infrastructure. You see, we'd had an earlier meeting. Democrats met with the leaders of the Trump administration to discuss an infrastructure bill. And when we suggested $1.5 trillion be spent on infrastructure, President Trump said, no, make it $2 trillion. Well, we were happy to hear that. And then when we suggested that President Trump's earlier suggestion of 80% of it being paid on a state and local basis rather than federal, he reversed himself and said, well, then it'll be 80% federal. More good news. Then came the suggestion, well, it shouldn't just be horizontal infrastructure, it ought to be vertical infrastructure, broadband, school buildings, things that we desperately need in America. And he said, include them. Let's make that part of the package. It was one of the best meetings. And then came the subject of how we were going to pay for it. And the President, Donald Trump, said, stop, I'm not going to get into that conversation. Well, we said, Mr. President, we've agreed on what we want to do, but we have to pay for it. And he said, no, you're not going to trap me with raising taxes or doing things that are politically unpopular. So we postponed a follow-up meeting to this May 22nd date, May 22nd, 2019. And we were anxious to get it done because during his presidency, there had been no infrastructure programs, none, nothing, despite his promises to the contrary during the campaign. We came back May 22nd, he walked in the room and he said to all of us assembled there, as long as you're investigating me for any reason, there'll be no infrastructure bill. Wheeled around and walked out. That was the end of the conversation about infrastructure in the Trump administration. It was never seriously considered or debated after that. Now we're engaged in a new exercise. Some Republican senators, and I thank them for their courage and initiative, want to sit down with Democrats and see if we can finally, after years and years, come up with an infrastructure bill to rebuild America. They're under pressure. They were under pressure from Senator McConnell. He didn't want them to engage in this kind of bipartisan negotiation. And now today, former President Trump has joined the chorus, saying they shouldn't bargain at all with Democrats. Put it off another year, 2 years, whatever it has to be, until the Republicans control the whole process. That is a recipe for achieving little or nothing, Madam President. We know that. So I sincerely hope that this week will be a breakthrough week. Senator Schumer, the Democratic Majority Leader, tried to get it started last week with a simple procedural vote that would move us to this conversation, but he was unlucky and was unable to get that done. But he's maintained the procedural option of reconsidering that vote, and I certainly hope that that will happen soon. Madam President, on a separate issue, we're at a pivotal moment in the fight against COVID-19. Thanks to the leadership of this administration, our nation has had one of the most successful vaccination efforts in the world. 340 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered in the United States. 80% of Americans over the age of 65 have been fully vaccinated, 80%. That means the vast majority of our senior population is protected from being hospitalized or dying from COVID-19. Yet at this moment, there's trouble on the horizon. Case numbers across the country are ticking back up. It's important to note why. The Delta variant is spreading like wildfire among unvaccinated Americans. This variant is much more transmissible. I've heard quotes from some that it's 1,000 times more transmissible than the original COVID-19. And it's quickly become the dominant strain of this virus in America. There's good news. The vaccines that we all have access to right now will stop the Delta variant in its tracks. They will save your life. And with the spread of the Delta variant, the reality for Americans is quickly becoming get vaccinated or risk contracting serious or a deadly case of COVID-19. As Dr. Walensky, the director of the CDC, said last week, and I quote her, "This is quickly becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated." Over the past week, we've started to see a renewed sense of urgency from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. They've finally become more vocal about dispelling disinformation about the vaccines. Even Fox News has begun airing public service announcements that encourage viewers to get vaccinated against the coronavirus. I applaud them for starting to join the chorus of scientific experts, health officials, and community leaders who've been calling on Americans to protect themselves and their loved ones. Because it was only a few weeks ago when a couple primetime hosts on Fox expressed their displeasure with me personally for criticizing their coverage of the vaccines. I was alarmed, said so on the floor of the Senate, by some of the ideas that Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham were peddling. Their anti-vax rhetoric quite simply put their viewers and their families of their viewers at risk. We can disagree on political issues, and I'm sure we will continue to do so, but we shouldn't play political games with life and death when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines. We've seen a shift in tone recently. Some hosts on Fox, specifically Sean Hannity and Steve Doocy, now encourage their viewers to get vaccinated. At the very least, they call on them to consult with their doctors. It's a move in the right direction, but we ought to make it clear once and for all, publicly where we can, that those who are spreading this anti-vax rhetoric are literally risking the lives of our fellow Americans. We're seeing that good comes from sharing facts about the vaccines and the potential to save lives. As of yesterday, the 7-day average of newly vaccinated Americans is up nearly a third over last week. Nearly 7 in 10 American adults now have one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. We need to keep it up. More than 610,000 of our family members, and friends, and neighbors in America have died from this disease, and millions more around the world. We have the power within our hands with vaccine to stop this pandemic. We all have to do our part. And I want to take an opportunity to recognize something else. Disinformation is not the only reason why people are not getting vaccinated. Sadly, there is a long history of racial bias in our nation's institutions, from education to housing to health care. And that history of racial bias has understandably led some Americans to question our institutions based on fear. So let me first say this: trust has to be earned, and we have a lot of work to do as a nation to address racial inequity in our healthcare system, like the fact that black women are 3 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related complications. Acknowledging these inequities, doing something about them, is how we can build and regain trust. That's the work we have to do. President Biden's American Rescue Plan was an important investment in tackling health disparities. It increased funding for community outreach, expanded support for community health centers. It provided an historic $1 billion investment in the National Health Service Corps to help recruit more doctors, nurses, and other health professionals from communities of color. That was a provision which I added to the bill. At this moment, if you're still unvaccinated against COVID-19 and you have questions, I'm sure you won't call your senator or your congressman. Reach out to a medical professional you trust. Talk with your doctor. Ask them whatever questions you wish, but make sure you have the facts on your side. Because the sad truth is the pandemic has deepened the existing racial disparities in America. Last year, there was nearly a 3-year drop in life expectancy among black and brown Americans. 3 years. Communities of colors have been 3 times more likely to be hospitalized, twice as likely to die from COVID. We can end this cycle of sickness and despair, but we've got to stop the spread of the new variants. So please consult a medical professional and ask them about getting vaccinated. Madam President, another issue in a committee that we both serve, Senate Judiciary Committee, is going to have an important hearing tomorrow on the issue of ransomware. For those who may be unfamiliar, ransomware is a type of malicious software that can infect a computer. If hackers attack your computer system with it, they can lock up all the data in your system and demand a ransom payment in exchange for unlocking. As a product of our digital age, ransomware is a relatively new threat, but it could impact any individual, business, or organization. Many Americans had a rude awakening about this threat earlier this year when a cybercrime syndicate used ransomware to shut down the largest petroleum pipeline in the United States, the Colonial Pipeline. That shutdown sparked a nationwide panic that had people lining up at gas stations for hours, and it put the threat of ransomware into plain view for all Americans. Perhaps someone you know had their world turned upside down by a ransomware attack. Tomorrow we're going to discuss it at length. Finally, Madam President, I want to note that we begin this week with yet another devastating toll of weekend gun violence across America, including the city of Chicago. More than 70 people were shot this past weekend in Chicago. 10 died, including a 17-year-old boy. If you'll remember 2 weeks ago, 4th of July weekend, over 100 people, victims of gunshots in Chicago. And in that case, 19 of them died. It's a mass killing on a regular basis in that great city. Much of it's concentrated in sections of the city, but it's starting to spread because it's so darned easy for a person to get their hands on a gun in that city. Shootings in Chicago have surged during the COVID pandemic. We see it happening across America. The Biden administration is taking steps in the right direction to stop this gun violence, cracking down on untraceable ghost guns, rogue gun dealers, and these braces, this equipment that can effectively turn pistols into short-barreled rifles. Crucially, the Department of Justice has also announced the launch of 5 firearm trafficking strike forces. Chicago is one of the cities. New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles are the others. These strike forces will confront what I believe to be one of the most important causes of this gun violence, the illicit trafficking of guns. These strike forces will also provide vital support to law enforcement, who are on the front lines of fighting gun violence. As a testament to that fact, last week, Attorney General Garland joined me in Chicago to highlight how the Justice Department is standing with our police officers and first responders. I'm grateful that Attorney General Garland returned to his hometown of Chicago for this purpose, but sadly it was a somber homecoming. We first met with police officers and the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, at the Harrison District Police Station. It is basically ground zero for gun violence in the city of Chicago. They demonstrated to us the brand new technology, the amazing technology, the video cameras, the shot spotters, new technology which they're using every single day to thwart the criminals and to prove their cases when necessary. These communities and these officers are keeping us safe as they can, but they're up against an avalanche of guns. The grim toll of gun violence in Chicago continues to climb upward. The officers agreed with Attorney General Garland and myself. A major problem is that we have guns being illegally sold to people who never should have had them, who never would pass a background check. Convicted felons are those who are mentally unstable. It's more important and more significant than any single jurisdiction. It's nationwide. Roughly 60% of the guns recovered at crime scenes in Chicago originate from out of state, primarily from Indiana, but also from downstate. A person can easily buy a gun from an unlicensed seller in Indiana and drive into Chicago in a matter of minutes, that very same day, to resell that gun on the streets. Why don't we do something about this? If those who own guns agree with everyone else that we ought to keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people, why can't this Congress do that simple thing to try to slow down this gun violence? There's one more truth we must acknowledge. Gun violence isn't just about access to weapons. Too many kids in cities like Chicago face daily trauma that is making them more likely to fall into the cycle of violence. During the Attorney General's visit to Chicago, we joined community leaders at St. Agatha Catholic Church in the Lawndale section of the city. They've developed a successful violence intervention program called Ready Chicago. It's one of the many community violence intervention programs that's received financial support from this president. While meeting with the leaders of Ready Chicago, I spoke with a young man whom I will call John. He's remarkably brave And after learning his story, one cannot ignore the similarities he shares with so many other young people in the city. He grew up in a struggling family. He sold drugs to earn money. Like many of his peers, he ended up carrying a gun and got involved with gang violence. He was arrested, convicted, and served time in prison. Then he came back to the community and wanted to start a different life. That's how he got involved with Ready Chicago, where he's now a positive force for change in his home city. It's an inspiring story, but that young man, John, in his early 20s, still remains at risk. He fears that his advocacy on behalf of this program has put crosshairs on his back in the neighborhood, and that his family may even be targeted as well. Every street corner in his neighborhood, every street he crosses, comes with a risk. He has to look around constantly to see if the gangbangers are going to target him. But still, even under this unimaginable stress, John is looking for a new path in his life. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said he'd like to apply to attend Chicago State University, which is near this area. I hope he can get there. I hope he'll be a success. But it's amazing that he still has that dream after all that he's seen. For young people in Chicago like him, there's no quick fix. If you grew up in a family without stability and security at home, in school, or in a neighborhood that many of us take for granted every day, it can harm your development and change the way you see the world. The CDC's landmark study on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, tells us that exposure to trauma is linked to risk of drug use, suicide, academic struggle, and many other problems. And if you're a young child experiencing this chaos, if you watch a family member get shot or violently assaulted, it leaves a scar called trauma. Trauma can stay with the child for life. That's why violence intervention programs like Ready Chicago are so important. Connecting these at-risk youth with cognitive behavioral therapy, paid transitional jobs, wraparound support services, resources that support a healthy development for children who are struggling with trauma. These are the resources that will change a young person's life and set them on a better path, a path where they can discover a passion or calling and ultimately give back to their community. We must invest in these long-term solutions to break cycles of violence and trauma. The bipartisan Rise from Trauma Act I've introduced with Senator Capito, Republican of West Virginia, and many colleagues is an important step in that direction. It would provide $5 billion that President Biden has called for in his Build Back Better agenda for community violence intervention. But we in the Senate need to take immediate steps to combat violent crime. Can't we just get together and agree that we don't want to sell firearms to people who are convicted felons? It seems so obvious, and there's such public support for it. I want my colleagues to understand that the problem of gun violence isn't confined to the city of Chicago. We have cities much smaller downstate that are seeing an increase in gun violence as well. It's time for us to do something about it. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. President. Madam President,
Republican leader,
ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
This weekend, we received the bad news that our friend and former colleague Mike Enzi was involved in a serious accident while riding his bicycle. Mike's colleagues on both sides of the aisle were sorry enough to see him depart the chamber and begin his well-earned next chapter just a few months ago. Mike and Diana were a fantastic Senate couple in every respect, from major legislative accomplishments to the generosity and kindness they showed to everyone from Senate staff to the pages. So, Madam President, I know members on both sides of the aisle are very much thinking of Mike at this time, praying for his health and for the entire Enzi family. Now, on an entirely different matter, American families are anxious and they are uneasy. The share of Americans who feel optimistic about our country's direction has plummeted by almost 20% just since the springtime. As recently as early May, nearly two-thirds of Americans said they were optimistic about the direction of the country. That was the highest figure that survey had recorded in 14 years. But alas, that has plummeted. Late last week, a new survey found that optimism is now a minority position. 55% of Americans are pessimistic. Approval of the new administration's handling of COVID-19 has tumbled. Their handling of the economy is underwater among independents. Fewer than 4 in 10 Americans approve of their handling of immigration, the border, or violent crime. Unfortunately, American families have ample reason to feel this way. The end of June clocked the highest annual inflation spike in more than a decade. The Democrats' stay-home bonus to workers who remain unemployed has slowed the recovery and helped keep workforce participation stagnant. Meanwhile, last year, as the far left put the squeeze on law enforcement funding in cities across the country, America faced a 25% increase in homicides. And after the Biden administration was very eager to claim ownership and spike the football on the vaccination trajectory, which they largely inherited from Republican leadership, we've now seen vaccination rates in many places plateau on what this White House has been insisting is their watch. This turn toward pessimism is especially stunning and especially sad because President Biden took office with wind at his back. Things were set up for a roaring success like no other presidential transition in recent memory. Thanks in large part to Operation Warp Speed, set up by the prior Congress and administration, we had multiple safe and effective vaccines that were beginning to circulate widely through the country. The new administration's so-called ambitious goal of about 1 million vaccines per day was already happening before they were sworn in. Thanks to the 5 bipartisan rescue packages that the Republican-led Senate passed last year, we were primed and ready for an historic economic comeback. Americans were excited and ready to build a comeback summer for the history books. But those incredible tailwinds have largely been squandered. That historic head start has been wasted through bad policy and, in many cases, needlessly divisive leadership. After a poorly targeted partisan spending package that even liberal economists warned could cause more inflation, American families are now feeling the pain and literally paying the price. After campaign rhetoric and then policy decisions that have made our southern border less secure, a predictable crisis is playing out. After a year of anti-police, anti-rule of law rhetoric from too many on the political left, a violent crime surge is hammering communities and making streets less safe all across our country. Oh, and as the new administration pulls back America's presence in the Middle East in a reckless and rushed fashion, terrorist leaders are simply jumping for joy. This is how you take a country from near-record optimism to serious pessimism in just 2 months' time. This is how you inherit favorable trends in just about every direction imaginable, but produce disappointment. And our Democratic friends' big master plan is yet another reckless taxing and spending spree, but even larger. Washington Democrats' big idea is to borrow, print, and spend our way to even more inflation and even higher costs for American families, along with a historic set of big tax hikes to boot. My friends across the aisle and down Pennsylvania Avenue should be less concerned about checking left-wing items off activists' wish list. And more of Democrats' partisan agenda comes online, the American people's pessimism grows and grows. The families of our country need a better approach. I suggest that before.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Senator from Alabama,
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
without objection.
Thank you. You know, there's an old saying that I have used quite often, but it bears repeating. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. You teach a man how to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. It's a simple yet insightful concept. Human beings often like things to be easy. It's just in our nature, but the reward for easy is very short-lived. Sometimes if you don't earn it, you don't understand it. If we work hard and challenge ourselves to improve, we reap the benefits for much longer. That is the American way. I'd tell this to my players over the years that I coached, but lessons learned that are applied to the football field also apply in life. This country owes you one thing, an opportunity. Sometimes people just need to be shown where that opportunity is at and encouraged to take it. And that's what everyone in this body should be focused on doing, opening doors for opportunity for the people of this country. President Biden seems determined to close those doors of opportunity by creating, it looks like, a future massive entitlement state. My Republican colleagues and I have talked a lot about the reckless tax and spend plan and the cost of that plan on American families. We're seeing rising inflation, which means dollars from your paycheck are not going as far. We're seeing costs rise on everyday goods that families need, food, gas, diapers, you name it, it's going up. This is a direct result of untargeted spending this year as we're trying to recover from a pandemic, the worst time in the world to be throwing government money at a pandemic. And now our Democratic colleagues looks like wants to spend $3.5 trillion more after spending $1.9 trillion back in February. And what gets talked about less than cost of this spending is the social and societal cost of all these new and expanded programs. While it may not be easy to see or measure, it's no less important. And that's what I want to talk about today. Let's remember how this started and how we got here. It started with President Biden's announcing two plans, great names. First was the American Family Plan, and then there was American Jobs Plan. Despite their confusing similar names on the face, they don't sound that bad. I'm for American families, and I'm for American jobs. But these plans are not about American families or American jobs. They're full of progressive items that can only pass the Senate through a reconciliation process. There won't be any Republicans that will vote for this. And Democrats know this. So now, here we are. With our colleagues stuffing the worst parts of President Biden's agenda, I'm talking about the most progressive items that only appease to the far left of their base into their latest package. And all of President Biden's progressive programs cost money, lots and lots of money. And they're going to pay for them with your taxpayer dollars, not the government dollars, taxpayer dollars. A lot of my colleagues have expressed concern with the Democrats' reckless tax and spend spree, but they aren't the only ones sounding the alarm. Folks back home have started to take notice, and there's a lot more collective wisdom among the folks back home than there have been here lately in Washington, D.C. So I brought a couple of letters with me today. These are folks from Alabama who wrote to me about their concerns with President Biden's massive spending plan. Here's what James Merrill from Huntsville, Alabama, wrote to me. I have been studying this atrocious Biden America's Family Plan, and it is clear that not only is the cost staggering, the implications of all the rules that will go with it will terribly impact all family life and our freedoms to manage our lives. It blatantly makes the middle class dependent on the government. Cradle to grave, a clear path to socialism. James, you are exactly right. And Rosa Hill in Birmingham, Alabama, had this to say, I have just listened to President Biden, and the ideas are ridiculous. We should be helping each other, not the government getting involved. Ms. Hill makes an important point. Much of this work can and should be done by our neighbors, churches, and people in the communities. The problem is we've been conditioned to wait for the government to do the hard work of helping the less fortunate for us rather than doing it ourselves. Half a century ago, President Lyndon Johnson launched the war on poverty. He and leading liberals at the time thought the answer to poverty was to dramatically increase the benefits the federal government would give out to the poor. Well, the war on poverty didn't work like its backers thought it would. The following decade was filled with economic stagnation, high inflation, gas lines, spikes in drug addiction, and horrifying rise in crimes across our country. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Just like what's happening today. Folks, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. We've already tried this. President Biden is determined to try the same worn-out policies today, throwing trillions and trillions of taxpayer money at the problem and hoping the problem goes away. It has been and still is the wrong solution. President Biden's reckless spending spree won't help struggling American families. It will trap them in the endless cycle of dependence on big government and taxpayer money. Just take a look at what President Biden has proposed in his Americans Family Plan. Government subsidized child care, free preschool, free community college, free. That seems to be the slogan of this administration. Of course, we all know that there's no such thing as free in this country. I've talked before about the fact that President Biden has proposed 30, you heard me right, 30 new taxes that the Democrats can choose from to pay for these free programs in their next spending package. 30 new taxes during the pandemic. According to one analysis by the Hoover Institution, President Biden's American Families Plan would add 21 million Americans to the federal government's list of beneficiaries. 21 million more people living off the government. Now, there are certainly people out there who need help. We all know that. But this plan opens the floodgates to taxpayers' funded benefits instead of concentrating on those that mostly need it. Under President Biden's plan, your family could make up to $200,000 and still qualify for federal health care. $200,000. We don't have to comb through the history books for examples on how these progressive policies fail. We don't have to look far. Just look at what we've done here recently in the insistence on keeping unemployment benefits historically high. My Republican colleagues and I have spoken about how these misguided benefits essentially paid people not to work, destroying small businesses all over the country. And our economy's progress has gone down as we try to recover from this pandemic. Republican governors across the country recognized the problem and decided to cut out the overly generous benefits months ago. Folks who needed help would get it, but they wouldn't be paid to sit at home, and then they wouldn't be sitting home when they could have been working at jobs that would help their families. Just about every Democrat governor has insisted on keeping these benefits. Now, what does that tell you? Insisting on keeping the benefits and not keeping the benefits. We've made some terrible decisions just in a short period of time. Well, we can already see the results of what's happening with these benefits. According to the monthly data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, states that cut the federal expanded benefit are closer to returning to pre-pandemic employment levels than the states that kept it. 13 of the top 15 states with the best unemployment numbers have all ended their federal expanded unemployment insurance. Why don't we learn from this misguided policy and not repeat it by spending money on bad outcomes? We seem to continue to do that every time we turn around. The reckless tax and spend spree to advance President Biden's progressive agenda isn't just unaffordable, it's un-American. The United States was founded on the ideas of personal liberty and self-reliance. Make you feel good about yourself, earning your own way. Not government handouts, best known as socialism. Since our founding, people have flocked to the United States because of the opportunity it gives citizens to succeed, not because of cushy government handouts, because our society valued and values hard work, grit, and determination more than the countries most of these folks have left behind. Again, this country owes you one thing, and that's an opportunity to succeed through education and hard work. Democrats want you to believe that you can only succeed with the government's help. Republicans believe in self-reliance, that you have within you God-given skills and potential to work hard and succeed. You have that. That's what this country gives you, which is why President Biden's reckless spending spree and expansion of government programs is so disappointing. The President and Democrats think success is measured by how much taxpayer money the government can spend. But real success is measured by how many people no longer need the help in the first place. Our efforts need to empower people to be free to live and work to build a better life for themselves and their families. The most successful anti-poverty program should eventually put itself out of business. So I say enough. Enough of continuously growing the federal government. Enough of the reckless taxpayer-funded spending sprees. Enough of trapping people in a cycle of dependence. Because a culture of dependency is a culture in decline. I say we work together to encourage people to seize the many opportunities in our country and have them wait around hoping the government will fix every problem life throws their way. We can't do that. It's long past time we get back to teaching folks to fish. Learn to fish themselves, to be self-reliant. That's a culture of hard work and resilience. That's the culture of the United States of America, the best country on the face of the earth. Madam President, I notice the absence of quorum.
Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. This has already been a...
The Senate is in a quorum.
I ask that we suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. This has already been a big week in Tokyo for Team USA, and I hope all of my colleagues have the opportunity to watch a few minutes of the Olympic Games over the next few weeks. Every year we hear so much from commentators and athletes about how the Games are an opportunity for the world to come together. And that's exactly how it once was. Unfortunately, the Olympics are also a target-rich environment for people in regimes that want to use these rare moments of unity to trick the world into ignoring evil. Before we were able to enjoy any of this year's double pike vaults or 400-meter freestyle swims, we were already worrying about the impending havoc casting a shadow over the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Late last year, the Chinese government began pilot testing a new digital currency that will inevitably knock other domestic mobile payment systems out of the marketplace. The digital yuan trial has already pulled in $5.3 billion, that is correct, $5.3 billion in transactions. And this month, we learned that cross-border payments are also on the table. In fact, the trial has been so successful that Beijing wants to expand testing at the 2022 Winter Olympics. Now, as much as I'd like to believe that this is an innocent effort to bring the world a little closer together, this is the Chinese Communist Party that we're talking about. And we shouldn't expect good faith, because that is not what we are going to get from the CCP. We have reason to believe that the Chinese government intends to use the digital yuan to conduct a massive surveillance operation on Chinese citizens and foreign visitors. It wouldn't be the first time something like this happened. The CCP has an unfortunate history of weaponizing emerging technologies against people they would like to control. They've used it against the Uyghurs, against freedom fighters in Hong Kong, and on the mainland against anyone who questions their party propaganda. They're already using digital payment platforms to spy on their own people. And if we're not careful, they're going to use them to spy on Team USA. This month, I sent a letter to the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee asking them to forbid our athletes from accepting or using the digital yuan while competing in Beijing. Madam President, the threats are changing, and far too often we see our allies and partners and even our own government ignoring those threats to preserve the status quo. You may be asking yourself, why is so much of the world willing to look the other way when confronted with genocide in Xinjiang or murdered protesters in Hong Kong? It's because speaking up can be dangerous, especially when it comes to challenging the CCP. China boasts the most in-demand market in the world. In fact, it's such a gold mine that you'll recall the NBA ignored large-scale child abuse at its training camps in China just to maintain access to broadcast advertising and merchandise revenue. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Communist Party has sunk its teeth into some of the most valuable tourist destinations on the face of the earth. On trade routes and strategic outposts, they've sold this program as an economic development initiative, but in reality, this debt trap diplomacy is really just an extortion scheme. Once these countries fall into the trap, it is almost impossible to escape. Even before the pandemic forced the U.S. into lockdown, I and several other of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle were ringing alarm bells about our supply chain security. China is the most dominant global source of rare earth minerals, technology infrastructure, and many active pharmaceutical ingredients. Long story short, there's a lot on the line for the people of the United States. Madam President, the cards are stacked against us. It would be really easy to protect that valuable status quo by ignoring human rights violations and extortion schemes and other overt attempts to make the world a little less free. But as much as we would like it to be, freedom is not humanity's natural state. It is fragile. It falls victim to the weak and the power-hungry alike. And if we're not careful, yes, it will slip away, like it has in so many other countries. Freedom does have to be fought for, and we need our leaders to set the example. That means staying focused on not following the example of countries that have given up their freedom. We don't want to live out the authoritarian nightmare that the CCP has created, but we also want to avoid becoming like nations that have already pawned their futures in pursuit of some grand socialist future. I fear that our new majority has already lost touch with what the American people actually want. They sure don't want what the Biden administration has been selling lately. I can definitely tell you that after a weekend in Tennessee. They don't feel taken care of. What they're feeling is that they are being manipulated. They want to know why President Biden and the Democratic majority keep trying to pawn off the freedom that makes us an example to the rest of the world in exchange for more government control that nobody asked for. I would encourage my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to remember that the American people entrusted them with the power that they're wasting on these radical wish list items. And that power can be taken away just as easily as it was given. The American people want to make certain that we do, as Ronald Reagan implored us to remember. And Madam President, as you know, last week I had that poster here on the floor. Freedom is always one generation away from extinction. It is our responsibility to fight for it, to pass it on. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Maine.
I note the absence of a quorum.
We're not in a quorum. Oh, yes, the clerk will call the roll. Thank you.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
This Majority Leader,
I move to proceed to legislative session.
the Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I'd like to move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Madam President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 257.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Gwen A. Wilcox of New York to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 257, Gwen A. Wilcox of New York to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Madam President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 258.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, David M. Prouty of Maryland to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 258, David M. Prouty of Maryland, to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today be July 26 be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Sure. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 122, Todd Kim of the District of Columbia, to be an Assistant Attorney General, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatorium call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Todd Kim of the District of Columbia be an Assistant Attorney General shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Kennedy. I was Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ball. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Resch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Casey, Collins, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Heinrich, Kane, King, Leahy, Manchin, Merkley, Padilla, Reed, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Warner, Warnock, Whitehouse. Mr. Brown, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Braun, Cotton, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Lummis, Marshall, Hall, Risch, Sass, Scott of Florida, Shelby, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Arono. Ms. Arono, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 54, the nays are 40. The motion is agreed to. The senator from Rhode Island.
Ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the following nomination, Cal number 165.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Ask consent.
Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Defense, Frank Kendall III of Massachusetts to be Secretary of the Air Force.
I ask consent that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, and if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all without intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection. Question occurs on the nomination. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Nomination is confirmed.
Ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business. The senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have one request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. Has the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 320, which was submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
SRES 320, authorizing the taking of a photograph in the Senate chamber.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I further ask that the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10:30 a.m. Tuesday, July 27th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Kim nomination post-cloture. Further, that all post-cloture time on the Kim nomination expire at 11:30 a.m., that if the nomination is confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
Senate stands adjourned until 10:30 tomorrow morning.